Hello and welcome. Tonight we're speaking about globalization. With me is Victor Menotti of the International Forum on Globalization. Victor, thank you for coming.
Thanks for the invitation.
All right. Well, I thought we might start with the history of your organization.
International Forum on Globalization was founded here in the San Francisco Bay Area in the early 1990s, and this was a time when the Cold War was just ending, and when U.S. corporations were going around the world, establishing new markets, trying to access new resources, and there was then a flurry of different trade agreements, North American Free Trade Agreement, the World Trade Organization, that were being negotiated by the U.S. and other nations. And we and some other writers, activists, analysts around the world saw this as something really new. We saw it as the globalization of corporate power that was happening through these trade agreements. And so IFG was created as a countervoice to that, because at the time it was only President Clinton who was cheerleading for the process, or some of the biggest corporations in the world who were saying that this is going to end poverty and this is going to clean up the environment, and there was no alternative analysis to really what all these things meant. And even at that time, I think a lot of activists were unsure what the implications would be. So the IFG was set up as sort of a learning space for activists to learn from each other, but also to project a counter voice of the implications for sustainability, for equity, for democracy, for human rights, for all the things that progressive constituencies care about.
And in fact, most of those fears, if not all, have played out.
They have. Unfortunately, most of the things that we predicted happened. They were, almost inevitable, because when you saw what the rules were that the biggest corporations were writing, you knew the rich were going to get richer and the poor were going to get poorer, and that was why there was a lot of opposition. As you saw in Seattle in 1999, IFG was very involved, not in organizing the street protests, but in doing...
There's a great video of you getting brushed by policemen during that.
You've seen that one,
protest.
yeah. It's, that actually became... I became the lead plaintiff as a result of that, of the ACLU suit. It was Menotti versus Seattle that took on the illegal ban and what was it called? Not censoring, but curfew that they did that night, and made people protest in certain areas. So there were a lot of constitutional violations that happened during the WTO street protests. And so we were very involved, though, in doing the research and the analysis and the information. And I like to think of it as some of the inspiration of people's protests in peaceful ways that happened in Seattle. And that was sort of, the international debut of this people's movement that continues today.
There was like a shift in the psyche where people thought, well, when you see hundreds and thousands of people protesting globalization and the World Bank, you realize that all the rosy things that you've been reading may not be so
rosy.
Might not be so rosy. Yes.
Yeah. Well, in the U.S., if we learn about the World Bank or the IMF in some course or reading some article, it often is, rosy, and it's, lifting the poor out of poverty and development. But we knew from being in touch with social movements around the world that there were, probably a couple decades of protests of people's movements against the World Bank dams, against their logging roads, and a lot of their infrastructure lending, as well as the International Monetary Fund's policies that put countries more and more into debt and imposed what were called structural adjustment policies, which had the effect of opening up their economies to more U.S. multinationals to get the resources, bring them back, and then ship them back to those countries as finished products, keep them in a debt cycle. So when Seattle happened, we saw it as sort of the U.S. waking up to what had been happening in the rest of the world for many years as a result of U.S. foreign economic policy. So it was kind of a breakthrough in terms of American social movements really aligning their economic justice with others around the world. in an analysis of global corporate power.
And over time, it seems that your focus really has broadened, because when you think about globalization and all the effects, you have serious environmental effects, you have serious inequality, loss of indigenous cultures, things like that. And so when you go to your website today, you see all of those things being addressed in papers or in meetings or press releases in some way or another.
Well, I think globalization and the globalization of corporate power touches almost every aspect of existence today. So I actually don't see how one can understand what's going on in the world right now unless one understands how corporate power is organized and how it expresses itself. And unless you see that, I think the result is you get parties like the Tea Party, or you get movements that blame government for everything. I don't think corporations are the reason to blame everything either. But what we're talking about is a system that places money over life itself, and that is ingrained into immigration policy, into education policy, into healthcare policy, and we see it everywhere. So don't be surprised if you see a lot of different issues covered on our website. In fact, that's still a very common critique from the mainstream media, which you saw in Seattle or what you see at Occupy Wall Street, which, I think in many ways has its roots in global justice and a lot of the same sensibilities for organizing that you saw in Seattle. Mainstream media will say, well, what are there's so many different signs and different interests and causes here, and they don't know what they're about, and it's confused. But, we really see it as it's one message.
It's not a lack of focus, it's just that it's a very broad focus. The more you open your focus, it necessarily takes in the whole situation, and that includes the military installations around the world and issues like that.
It's a critique of the system that we're living under, from many different voices who are impacted negatively by that system. So there are many different expressions of it, many forms of resistance to it, but rarely is it recognized as a single issue that everybody is reacting to.
You've co-authored some papers with the Post-Carbon Institute that focuses on peak oil and some of their key issues. It seems like there's a lot of overlap there.
Well, we reached a point a few years ago, quick review, like from Seattle, 1999, fast forward, we continued that work. We continue it to today, monitoring the WTO and its attempt to try to expand itself. I remind everybody that Seattle stopped around from being launched. That was a huge victory for people's movements who were trying to contain the globalization of corporate power from expanding. But it was 18 months later, literally weeks after September 11, 2001 happened, that they were able to launch the round in Doha, Qatar, the Persian Gulf Kingdom. They had to go hide to be able to have the negotiations after Seattle. So that was November 2001. Fast forward to November 2011, or even now, they still haven't finalized that round. And that's been a result of people's movements around the world, South African labor unions, peasant farmer families in Brazil, small farmers in India, and groups in the US working together to figure out how do we keep these governments from coming together to any agreement that's going to expand corporate power anymore. So it's really been a fantastic working model of people's resistance to global corporate power. The problem is we've only managed to contain it from expanding. We haven't built enough power yet to actually transform the rules and shift power. So I think a few years ago, moved to more offensive opportunities that we saw with indigenous rights. And IFG played a role with indigenous organizations of passing the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's still the newest human rights institution in the world, and actually actively being applied in a lot of decision making, from the international down to the local level. We got very involved, like you said, in the climate negotiations and dealing with energy, peak oil. We've always had an ecological view in our approach to economic issues of trade and finance and so on. But we began to really work on, for instance, the climate issues, because in part we saw the negotiating energy of governments going from the WTO to the climate talks. So we knew that was going to have maybe even bigger implications on how the world was organized, of getting off of fossil fuels. So that's where we focused our energies over the past few years.
Is it frustrating that we see global warming, we're seeing the effects today, and you see them in Central California with almond growers and cherry growers and many other farmers. So we're seeing these things that we were told our children would see them. First it was our grandkids, and then it was our kids, and now, in fact, we're seeing these things.
We're seeing them now. I mean, this summer, 2/3 of our country was covered in severe or extreme drought. It's happening now. So,
and yet there was a presidential debate last night, and you could tell that the issue was nowhere on the table.
No, I mean, one President Obama will talk about clean energy, and the other will talk about clean coal and sort of all forms. Actually, both of the candidates have sort of what they call all of the above approaches, which is, let's exploit every resource that we have. The biggest imperative is growth, growth, growth. Of course, the Democrats are more oriented to having some sort of carbon policy, whereas the Republicans, actually in the Romney economic plan, it is to entirely remove the EPA from even regulating carbon, which, when we look at who the donors are and the big fossil fuels interests, that's what you'll see right now on our website is, we begin to look more and more at following the money, who are the big interests that are blocking climate policy in the U.S.
The Koch brothers.
As in what we found was, bigger than Exxon are the Koch brothers. They outspent them by a factor of 4 to kill climate legislation, in lobbying expenditures, in climate denial science that they've been funding over the years. That's Greenpeace's figure, 4-1 over Exxon. But as we've mapped out their broader influence network, the think tanks that they use, the AstroTurf organizations, the media manipulators, it's way beyond 4-1. We haven't calculated yet, but it goes way beyond that. So when we look at who's actually blocking stuff and who's actually increasing their power by installing more Tea Party ideologues, which the Kochs founded and still fund, they're trying to seize the Senate. They're trying to grab as much control over they have over the levers of government at all levels in this country. And it's
And these are literally the richest people in the world.
That's what the new figures show.
Carlos Slim is the richest, but between them, the two brothers who act as one are even richer.
You got it. You got it. So, the two big indicators are the Bloomberg Billionaires Index, and we just saw this the other day, that their combined income now puts them higher than Carlos Slim. And you're exactly right. We consider them a single financial, political, ideological entity that is not motivated merely by profit. That's sort of for the Exxons of the world. They are about an ideology that they call economic freedom. And if you go to economicfreedom.org, you will see the talking points that Mitt Romney is using right now, which he tries to make sound like, it's about the little business guy, and not about the big billionaire that's got more money than anybody on the planet.
Well, I think it was Galbraith that originally made it very clear that, that you can, at a certain size, a corporation can make risk go away. You don't see the big corporations failing because they have the technology, they have the funds for research, they're able to diversify, and so really their risk ratio is much smaller than a small business. It's a different game.
It's true.
Entirely.
It's true. And when you see how the Kochs have played it, they started with their father Fred invented cracking, which is what turns crude oil into gasoline. and he built refineries, went to Stalin's Russia and built refineries. But the sons took over that business and got into piping and shipping and storage. Now they're big in fracking, they're big in ranching and fertilizers and forestry products, and so they've really diversified into this multi-sectoral, earth-destroying organization. But they've used the income from that to make the big money, which is in the financial markets. And they've done that by, they boast about inventing the oil swap, and they boast about with Enron having created the market and making sure that it was deregulated, and then finally globalizing it through the international, the ICE exchange, as it's called, in London. And that's what really sent their wealth.
Yeah, their net worth went up.
It quintupled.
Yes.
Quintupled, fivefold, from 2005 to 2011. I mean, yeah, they've been billionaires for a long time, but it's only recently that their wealth has gotten so big. That's why, we're hearing about them now. And it just
at some point, you're not just playing the game, you're owning the game.
Well, that's exactly what we see. People say, oh, it's speculation. They've got it where they've rigged the rules and it's not even betting now. Because what the Kochs do is they control so much refining, supply, shipping, storage, and other aspects of the energy markets. They have inside information. There's no ban on inside information in commodity trading. So they then use that information to be able to place bets. They park oil tankers of goods off of the coast and then wait for the price to go up and then sell it back on the market. And this is how they've quintupled their net worth. And we think of it as they have lined their pockets by picking the pockets of middle America and people who are locked into an infrastructure of fossil fuels, which unfortunately or ironically are the main people that they've managed to manipulate and get them to support them in their ideology.
That is baffling, isn't it?
It takes a lot of money to convince people of things, but if you do enough ads and enough to the think tanks, and you fill the whole marketplace of ideas with their ideas, that's how they've manufactured that consent.
It's a shame that Barack didn't make more of that or even go after that last night.
What wasn't mentioned, neither party really has an interest in taking on the big donors. Of course, the Republicans rely on much bigger donors, but it's a sick system that all politicians are addicted to. And that's where this needs to go. That's where the movement energy, the organizing energy, needs to go to deal with the money in politics, or what I call the money corrupting democracy in this country.
Well, there was a book called Democracy, Inc., Sheldon Wolin, and he talked about, Sheldon Wolin is a longtime political writer, and he spoke about how democracy has been hollowed out, and it's really a veneer. It's a veneer for industrial capitalism and global free markets to just assert themselves and colonize these developing countries, quote unquote. And I think it's true.
I think that's capitalism. It's an ideology, it's a system where those who have the capital, that is where the power is. And so we know they're going to express their interests and try to shape the rules, but there need to be limits on how they're going to intervene or weigh in. And I don't think corporations can have it both ways. They can't say, we're all about profit and fiduciary responsibility, and the law says we have to maximize profit, and then at the same time have a role in a democratic participatory process that's supposed to be about the public good and community.
That's the tragedy of Citizens United right there.
That they were, constitutionally enabled to exercise their money as speech, and corporations as people to get the rights of constitutional rights of people. So that's one of the big areas where in our reading, a lot of organizations are coming together around two main goals that need to be moved on. And that's one, a constitutional amendment. that deals both with the question of money equaling speech and corporations being persons. Both of those things need to be undone. At least, it probably needs to go farther than that.
Proportional representation has to be addressed.
The other big issue that people agree on anyway is publicly financed elections.
Yes.
There are a lot of things like Senate rules and jurisdictions and proportional representation. There is a whole menu of policies that have to happen. But what we're seeing is groups converging around those two ideas right now. And our hope is that these elections right now are so outrageous to so many Americans that post-2012, no matter who's in office, there's serious momentum for dealing with these issues of official corruption.
So the IFG is focused also on the Pacific and specifically an island in the south of the Korean Peninsula, where there's a huge military base going in.
Yeah, we think of it as, we are dealing with the two biggest power shifts in the world right now. The first one we've been talking about is the upward redistribution of wealth and power. It's called the Plutonomy program, and that's looking at the top billionaires and how they're wielding their wealth to undermine democracy. The second one you're talking about now is our Asia Pacific program, and that's about the shift in U.S. power from the Atlantic to the Pacific to respond to the rise of China and to not just contain it, but to encircle it through expanded military bases, through new commercial policy that will restrict their access to resources while expanding access for our multinationals.
It's an anti-ballistic system also, yes?
On
that island.
In Jeju,
Yeah.
it's called the Aegis Missile System, AEGIS.
Yes.
I believe it's Northrop Grumman who makes that system. The U.S. government got the South Korean government to host it, so we can't say it's a U.S. base. But the U.S. is integrated with it, and it's 500 miles from Beijing. So, this is something you rarely hear about, that, we're saying China's being aggressive. China has one aircraft carrier as of 1 year ago, and it has 0 military bases in the Pacific, whereas the U.S. has hundreds, and it's expanding them. So this to be able to protect the shipping lanes of, they want to protect trade. The U.S. military considers it to be, the U.S. is protecting the global commons. Of course, our real interest there is to protect our multinationals' passage of goods, access to those resources, shipping of those goods around the world to global markets.
So the commons has been redefined.
As the Pentagon defines it, it's the global commons, but to ensure our access to it and not let China control it. So you have flashpoint military conflicts that could erupt almost any time off the Philippines, because there are gas and oil reserves off of there. In Vietnam, where Chevron is now the largest foreign investor because of big offshore finds there, and with all the labor now moving from China, which is rising in wages, to Vietnam, which is still now the lowest cost, but it doesn't have the energy yet, so Chevron is there to bring that, but China is claiming those seas as China's and not as those of the surrounding neighbors. So there's so much energy in that South China Sea, they think of it as their Persian Gulf. And this is one area where you really might see some conflict. There are a number of other flashpoints around the region. The islands between Japan and China has been in the news this week. Burma is now opening up, and of course the U.S. is moving in there very quickly, because that's a foothold right on the mainland there, where, again, just blocking China's access to the coast or to resources is sort of what the U.S. strategy is.
So it sounds like there's a movement of movements these days that some of the more higher profile nonprofits are getting together and banding together and trying to react as one, pooling their resources.
On all these issues, I'd say, at least in the Pacific, what we're trying to do is to bring together those communities who are fighting expansion of U.S. military bases, who are fighting President Obama's Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is NAFTA for the Pacific. And to see the big picture here is dwindling resources and multinationals and their governments now competing for them, and that we need to respond as grassroots communities to not let the elephants start a war and crush everybody. So it's really a bottom-up, rise-up communities who are resisting this now, but to see the bigger picture and how we're all relating to these larger dynamics, and to respond in full force in some way to those things. With the plutonomy issues, of course, there's a lot going on in the U.S. with that. Occupy did manage to change the conversation, and a lot of Occupy activists are, very involved in some of the things that we're doing right now. But I think, even the non-organizations and the organizations are increasingly seeing that we all need to converge around the issue of money and politics and basic democracy. I think of the message of Occupy being brilliant. It's about public control of capital. It's about establishing democratic governance of our financial system. But I think we've seen that we can't really do that until we seize back control over who's writing the rules. Because right now you have the Koch brothers who have benefited so much and are fighting tooth and nail to stop the implementation of the Dodd-Frank Act on Wall Street reform, that they own a lot of the chairs of those committees. So there's really no hope of doing that until we build power to remove the change campaign contributions and the way things are elected. It is basic democracy that's not working.
Do you think it can be done?
I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be doing the work I'm doing if I didn't think it was possible. I think for a lot of people, it's about the future of the planet and what we're leaving behind, as well as you said earlier, the crises and the violations of human rights that are happening now. I personally feel like I don't have a choice. This is just what I get up and think about every day, and it's a challenge to find a way to be effective. The only way is to unite different movements against this concentrated wealth that's accumulated as a result of globalization. So they have money, we have numbers.
Think we need more Seattles?
In the sense that we need, popular mobilizations that are going to raise consciousness and get people engaged and result in containing and pushing back corporate power.
Well, I think we have about a minute left. How could a viewer who's sympathetic to what you're doing help the IFG?
Well, I think the first thing is check us out, ifg.org on the web. See what we do. Send us money if you like what we do. And if not, we have all kinds of ways you can support us. We need good writers. We need good researchers. We need people with graphic skills, people with social media skills or web development skills, or organizing skills, photography skills. So there are all kinds of ways that people can support IFG's work and all the allies that we work with.
Good. All right, Victor, well, thank you very much for coming here and speaking about the issues. And I hope you also will come back and we could go over them one by one in more detail.
Okay, very good.
All right.
Thanks again.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for watching. Good night.